Hi everyone, thanks for watching this video. This is part one of what I hope to be a 5 or 6 part series talking about the character arc conclusions, or lack thereof, of the 6 main characters that have been in the Marvel Cinematic Universe over the past 11 years. I'm talking, of course, about Captain America, Steve Rogers, Iron Man, Tony Stark, Natasha Romanoff, or Black Widow, Clinton Barton, or Hawkeye, and then Bruce Banner, Hulk, and Thor. So right off the bat, I want to say that there will be spoilers in this video. So if you haven't watched the movie, please go ahead and do that if you don't want it spoiled. Also, we're going to be talking about, we're not going to be talking about any of the potential plot holes that were in this movie, and some of the problems that time travel introduction into the cinematic universe may have created for continuity. Instead, we're going to be focusing just on the character arcs of each of these 6 main characters, and this is going to be part one, talking about Thor. So we'll jump right in. Now, if you rewind all the way back to the first Thor movie, it becomes apparent very early on that Thor has 3 main character flaws. First of all, he's self-serving. Second, he's overly self-reliant. And then, worst of all, number 3, he's hot-headed. He has an overactive sense of vengeance and thinks he can carry it out on his own. One of the first scenes in that first movie is when Loki and Thor are both children. And Loki, upon hearing about the stories of the Frost Giants, asks Odin, do the Frost Giants still live? Whereas a young Thor says, when I'm king, I'll hunt down the monsters and slay them all, just as you did, father. So right there, we kind of see that he looks before he leaps, and he immediately wants to bring about vengeance when he doesn't even know why there would be a need to fight them. And later on, right before Odin casts Thor out, they're arguing about what Thor did, and Odin is trying to correct him. And Thor tells Odin, "You're an old man and a fool." So very hot-headed, not willing to listen to the wisdom of his father, not willing to try to understand his mistake. But we begin to see throughout the first movie that Thor begins to change. He actually starts to learn a little bit of how he's been self-serving, and we see that in his conversation with Eric Selvig. Eric says to him, "It's not a bad thing finding out that you don't have all the answers. You start by asking the right questions once you find out that you don't have all the answers." And Thor says, "For the first time in my life, I have no idea what I'm supposed to do." And Eric responds, "Anyone who's ever going to find their way in this world has to start by admitting they don't know." And then, of course, by the ending, Thor has become willing to sacrifice his life to save others. And in so doing, he's learned to serve others, and he's let go of or mortified that self-serving character flaw. So by the end of the movie, we've seen some progress in his character. Then, if you move on to Thor: The Dark World, a lot of people criticize this movie, and they say that Thor: The Dark World what wasn't the best Marvel movie, and that's perhaps understandable. But the thing you have to understand about Thor: The Dark World is it's actually less about Thor and more about Odin and Loki. Thor is more of a static character in this movie, whereas we start to see another side to Odin, and we start to see a side to him that has been changing since long in the past. But it's still occurring. It's not yet complete. And we begin to see the beginning of a change in Loki. So it's, again, this movie is less about Thor and more about Odin and Loki. So in Odin, we start to see that in the Dark World, he is hypocritical of Thor's flaws, which are the same flaws that Odin had. There's the scene where he has a conversation after Malekith is invaded Asgard. And Thor says, "Let me take Jane away from here. Malekith will surely follow and capture her to draw out the ether from her. But in doing so, he'll be vulnerable and I can defeat him." And Odin replies, "No, We have what he wants. He will return, and when he does, we'll defeat him. And Thor disagrees, and he says, we can't fight an enemy that we cannot locate. He could be over us right now, and we'd never know. How many Asgardian lives do we have to sacrifice? And Odin kind of has this furious moment where you see him become a little bit hot-headed, just like he criticized Thor for being. And he says, as many as is needed, until the last Asgardian falls, until the last drop of blood is shed. And Thor asks a very important and good question. He says, well, what makes you so different from Malekith then? And Odin kind of replies in this very dark way by saying, the difference, my son, is that I will win. So right in that moment, you're kind of seeing that he doesn't answer Thor's question. Thor is asking a question about morality. He's asking essentially, well, okay, if we believe that the ends justify the means no matter what, then how are we not evil like the Dark Elves are, is really the moral question he's asking. And Odin doesn't answer it. He simply responds with his own version of vengeance, with his own version of hot-headedness, saying that the difference is I will just win. So he doesn't answer Thor's question about the right and wrong, and which is a moral question. And we see more of Odin's kind of darker side when he's talking with Loki, and he says, all of this because you desired a throne. And Loki replies, it's my birthright. And Odin says, your birthright was to die as a child, kind of in this another moment of rage. And he says, you were supposed to be cast out on a frozen rock. If I hadn't taken you in, you would not be now here to hate me. And Loki, in a vulnerable emotional moment, says, well, if I'm here for the axe, then mercy's sake, just swing it. As if to say, why did you take me in? If it wasn't out of love, then why was it? Are you here to glorify yourself as though you did something that's good when it wasn't done out of love? And again, Loki is raising an excellent question here for Odin, sort of calling into question Odin's benevolence, and rightfully so. And we also see it when Odin, a little bit in how Odin treats Jane Foster when she arrives in Asgard with the ether sickness, and she says she doesn't belong in Asgard any more than a goat belongs at a banquet table. So pretty cool. And I think what we're seeing here is that Odin is hypocritical of Thor's flaws, which are his own same flaws, that perhaps he doesn't have them as much now, but as we'll see more, and we see the history of Odin revealed in Thor Ragnarok by Hela, we'll see that Thor is being criticized by Odin for the same flaws that Odin had. And it's almost reminiscent of the story in the Old Testament when Nathan the prophet confronts King David over the adultery with Bathsheba and the murder of Bathsheba's husband, Uriah. And as Nathan confronts him, he tells him a story that there was a rich man who, instead of killing one of his own sheep for the slaughter for a banquet, he steals the only sheep that a poor man owned and slaughters it in order to feed his guests instead. And this story enrages King David. And he says, that man deserves to die for what he did because he had no mercy. He had no compassion. And Nathan then responds, you are the man. You are the man. You were given the kingship and all of the blessings that go along with it. And yet you murdered this innocent man and took his wife as your own. And you had no mercy. And in that moment, David realizes that he is the man and he has sinned. And he says, I have sinned against the Lord. Well, Odin isn't at that stage yet where he's willing to confess, but we see that Odin is hypercritical of Thor's flaws, which are the same flaws that he had, just as David was hypercritical of the flaws in this story that Nathan tells him that he had. So there's a lot of that going on there. And we've seen a lot more of Odin's darker side in this movie. We also see some character progress in Loki that by the end of the movie, when Loki, you think he's dead, and Thor tells him, I will tell Father that you died with honor. And Loki says, I didn't do it for him. It's kind of a touching moment, even though it may come across a little bit cheesy, because Loki is beginning to change. He's actually beginning to say to Thor, "You are the brother that that I've wanted. That's a good man and a good brother and a good family member." Okay, so that's a little bit about Odin and Loki, but this is about Thor. So Thor is more of a static character in Dark World, but in Thor Ragnarok, you have to realize the whole tone may change a little bit, and the visual style may change, but also the subject matter changes in Thor Ragnarok quite a bit as well. Thor 1 was about Thor, and we saw him mortify that self-seeking attitude, and then the Dark World was more about Loki and Odin. But Ragnarok is actually about all three of them. And Ragnarok, I think, gets us about 80% of the way to the end of a good character arc for all three of them. And hopefully you'll see why here as we continue. Now, what's interesting is that the reveal about Odin's past is scattered through the stories that Hela tells. So, we'll be going a little bit out of order as we talk about it as far as the chronology of the movie goes. But we see that concerning Odin, once Hela arrives in Asgard, she uses her magic knives to rip down the dome of the Asgardian palace, and behind it, behind what is supposed to be a beautiful mural, is a much darker mural highlighting Hela and Odin's conquests. And she says, "Look at these lies: goblets and garden parties, peace treaties. Odin, proud to have it, but ashamed of how he got it." Very telling. And then that conversation is continued later on, towards the end of the movie, when Thor has arrived back on Asgard, and Hela has a conversation with him. She says, "It would seem that our father's solution to every problem was to cover it up." And Thor replies, "In agreement, surprisingly, or to cast it out. He told you you were worthy. He said the same thing to me." And Hela replies and says, "You see, you never knew him, not at his best. Odin and I drowned entire civilizations in blood and tears. Where do you think all this gold came from?" And so, in this moment, this is an interesting and terrifying reveal, because we see that the person and character of Odin that we looked up to as this wise allfather was not nearly as wise, not nearly as benevolent, not nearly as good as we thought him to be. That everything he had built on Asgard was built at the expense of the genocide of the Nine Realms. So a terrible reveal and about Odin, and we see that later on. Actually, it's earlier in the movie. When Odin is departing, that Odin starts to actually acknowledge everything that's bad about what he had built, and he begins to sort of confess or hint at to his sons that he failed them. And we see that when Thor and Loki both go to Norway, and they see Odin, staring out at the ocean, and Thor responds to him. He says, "I know we failed you, Father, but we can make this right." And Odin replies, very surprisingly, he says, "No, I failed you. Ragnarok has already begun. She's coming. My life is all that held her back." So there he's beginning to reveal, he's beginning to confess who he really was. He was a brutal conqueror. And Odin says, "She draws her strength from Asgard," referring to Hela. This is why and I think this is important. An important statement, because what we're really seeing here is that this is why Asgard needs to be destroyed. I didn't like it at first when the characters have to rely on Surtur to destroy Asgard, because it's kind of like, well, wait a minute. So they're going to solve the problem of Hela by sort of letting this giant, evil, satanic-looking creature smash their city to pieces, and that's how they're going to defeat Hela. Well, that's kind of lame. That doesn't seem fitting for the good characters. But in one sense, it kind of works, because Odin created a machine of death, Hela, and the only way to stop her was to let go of the kingdom he had built by his own sin. Because everything that Asgard has been built on was built on the blood and tears and the gold of other civilizations. He was a brutal conqueror, and it wasn't until later that he had realized the error of his ways. So only by destroying this kingdom that had been built by Odin's own sin can you stop this death machine Hela, and that's why Asgard needed to be destroyed. So that moment when he's passing away and he's beginning to confess is a huge moment for Odin, and it's important for Loki and Thor as well, because Odin actually says to both of them, "I love you, my sons," and it's really a touching moment because Tom Hiddleston acts it very well. He doesn't say a word, but with a look as Loki, with a look of surprise and the hint of joy when Odin says, "I love you, my sons," he kind of looks up with joy and sort of shock in his eyes. It's a very touching moment for Loki, and he's receiving something that clearly he had never received before. So then that's kind of the end of Odin's character arc, but then Thor's and Loki's arc continues when they're on Sakaar. Loki says, here's the thing, towards the end when they're about to depart, he says, "I'm probably better off staying on Sakaar." And Thor agrees with him, and he says, "Oh, this place is savage, it's chaotic, lawless, you're going to do great here." And Loki, sadly, says, "Do you truly think so little of me?" And Thor says, "Well, I thought the world of you." And so, kind of a sad moment, and Loki kind of having to question the approval that he's not receiving from his brother. But then by the end, when Loki arrives, Loki shows back up with the ship and decides to help his brother put an end to Hela and to save the Asgardians. And finally, as they're floating away on the ship and watching Asgard be destroyed, Thor says to Loki, "Perhaps you're not so bad after all, brother." And Loki says, "Maybe not," with a smile on his face. So I think this is the beginning of Loki becoming an actual good and noble character. He's starting to leave his usurpacious and sort of clandestine opportunist ways behind. And it's an important moment for Thor as well, because he's had to learn to not be so self-reliant. There's that special moment that's delivered in a way that only Anthony Hopkins can deliver when Thor, the best of Thor's strength has failed to stop Hela. And he says, "I'm not as strong as you, father." And Anthony Hopkins, as Odin says, "No, you're stronger." And Thor realizes all along that Mjolnir was only there to help him channel his power. It wasn't his source of strength. And he learns that he can conjure lightning without the hammer, which is fantastic. So I think this is important to realize, that Thor had the power of lightning all along, but he needed a power greater than himself. He needed Odin's reminder to sort of awaken it in him, to help him understand that it was given to him. So, and it's also important because by the end of Thor Ragnarok, he's overcome his self-serving attitude from the first movie. He's overcome his overactive self-reliance, because he's now fighting as a team. He's fighting alongside Loki and Korg and Meek and Heimdall and Valkyrie. Don't forget, there's this beautiful moment where Valkyrie, who's been drinking herself in a haze for however long, and she's been inspired by his statement that "I run towards my problems, not away from them, because that's what heroes do," that she's now coming along. And I love that scene where she has all of her armor back on, and she kind of has this triumphant strut walking away with the fireworks in the background. She's gonna don her armor once again and fight alongside her king. Just a beautiful moment of growth for her. So by the end of Ragnarok, we see Thor has now he's now put to death. He's now mortified these character flaws of self-serving nature and this overactive self-reliance, because he's working as a member of a team. He's confessed his weakness to his dad, and in so doing has received the strength that's now unlocked, that he wasn't able to fully unlock before. So then we see, moving on to Infinity War, we see Loki actually become a good character, because he fights against Thanos and dies. But Thor then he still has not yet mortified his hot-headed nature, and it gets him trouble in the end of Ragnarok. We see, sorry, it gets him into trouble at the end of Infinity War because he very nobly goes to Nidavellir to forge the hammer, and he's gonna try to stop Thanos, but in the end, when he should have gone for the head, he throws the Stormbreaker axe into Thanos and then kind of gloats over him, telling him, "I told you." You die for that. But if he had just gone for the head, if he had just not wanted to have that moment of rubbing it in, of sort of hot-headed vengeance, he actually could have ended Thanos right then, and Thanos would not have been successful in snapping away half of the universe. But he fails, and I think that that's a moment of failure for him. He once again, his hot-headed nature got the best of him, and he couldn't do what he needed to do. So then now we roll around to Endgame, and I think it's perfect, and it makes sense for Thor to be depressed because perhaps he, better than any of the other Avengers, had the power to stop Thanos and failed. But it's far too late in Thor's character arc to suddenly introduce another very different character flaw. This sort of indifference and laziness and indolence, especially considering that those are the opposite character flaws of the ones he still has, the recklessness and being hot-headed. Inaction and passivity have never been characteristic of Thor. Quite the opposite. He's always looked before he leaps. He's always been hot-headed. He's always been reckless. So to introduce this new character flaw that's sort of the polar opposite of the ones we've seen and we know Thor has, it's far too late in his character arc, and it's almost disrespectful to the character and everything that he's accomplished and grown in so far. And plus, if we rewind back to Ragnarok just a little bit, we remember that there's that scene when Thor first realizes that it's not Odin, ruling Asgard, it's Loki in disguise. And he talks about how he went around the universe investigating to find the Infinity Stones. And he found the 9 realms in chaos and the enemies of Asgard assembling. All the while, Odin, the protector of those 9 realms, was sitting there in his bathrobe eating grapes. So right there, he's criticizing this, what he believes to be Odin, but really Loki, and Odin's indolence, his laziness. So for him to all of a sudden now have that same character flaw in spades is jarring and really not in line with Thor's character at all. And that's where I think they really failed him in Endgame. They didn't understand his character progression. So I think they really ruined Thor in Endgame. And then it's important to note that that I think it's fine for him to be depressed, but for him to be lazy and sort of indifferent, no, that's not Thor. One other thing about Endgame that I think is just really just terrible is this scene where they have Rene Russo as Frigga, and she tries to give him some advice in this. What she says is really just poor philosophy and poor writing. It's really kind of stupid what she says. She says everyone fails at who they're supposed to be, Thor, but the measure of a person, of a hero, is how well they succeed at being who they are. No, it's yes, everyone does fail at who they're supposed to be. That is true. But the measure of a person, of a hero, is not how well they succeed at being who they are. No, quite the opposite. Everyone has character flaws, and everyone has issues and weaknesses, and the measure of a person is how well they succeed at recognizing those flaws and recognizing that they need to repent of those flaws. And yes, sometimes that requires outside help, and that's fine. But to just simply succeed at being who you are, that doesn't take any special character or measure of a person at all, because that's all what we naturally do as human beings. But rather to recognize our own flaws and to try to mortify, to correct, to end our flaws is really the mark of a person and the measure of a person. So that scene, I get what the writers were trying to do, but it just falls flat. It really is poor philosophy. And I think what really needs to happen is a moment where Thor has one last vision of Odin. I don't know, perhaps in Valhalla or something. But this time it's different because not only is Frigga there, and but Loki is there, and 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 he realizes that Loki made it. And maybe also you could have the whole host of the departed souls of the Asgardians, and the whole purpose of this would be to show implicitly that Loki made it, that Loki became good in the end, and that the terrible sins of Odin and how he had built his civilization had been confessed, and that finally the dysfunction of the royal family and the lies that covered up the devastation on which Asgard was founded are atoned for and forgiven. And then I don't know, maybe seeing all of this Thor breaks down and confesses that he never learned to mortify his own appetite for vengeance, his hot-headedness. And then maybe Odin perhaps gives him one last parting gift, like his golden eye patch, which Thor exchanges for the fake eye that Rocket gave him as a symbol of letting go of false ways of seeing and finally gaining wisdom, which is true sight. So, I'm just kind of spitballing. It doesn't have to be exactly like that. But I think this would be the sort of thing that shakes Thor out of his depression a little bit. And again, totally disagree with the laziness and him being the way he's portrayed as a slob and a drunken mess and just being lazy. But a little bit of depression, I think, would have been fitting. But this could be the thing that shakes him out of it, and that gives him the completion for his story arc, or at least his character arc. And then he doesn't need to have a big entrance like he had in Infinity War. He can fight as a true member of the team now, because he's now mortified and completed and finished and done away with the last of his character flaws. He's gotten rid of his self-serving nature in the first movie. He's not self-reliant like he was before Thor Ragnarok. He solved that one. And now here in Endgame, he's no longer fighting for revenge, for his own vengeance. He's fighting for justice. So I think that would be something that indicates that, something where he sees the dysfunction of Asgard and his family healed, and that gives him the wisdom to fight for justice. And perhaps equally frustrating is that at the end of Endgame, Thor abdicates his throne, giving it to Valkyrie. This is just a terrible reversal. It's asinine writing, because it was Thor who inspired Valkyrie to return with him to Asgard and hope again that Hela could be stopped and defeated. And then, hopefully Valkyrie could quit drinking then. This is the type of leadership that, a once glorious but now wrecked civilization needs. A humble leader who has tasted the sorrow of loss, yet will endure the worst for his people. So yeah, they really, really Last Jedi'd Thor. They made Thor a loser, and it's really a shame, because they could have done so much more with him. And now some of you will of course say, well, Chris Hemsworth's contract isn't over. They still need him to grow as a character so he can be in more movies. They're setting him up with the Guardians of the Galaxy. And yes, you're right. There's one important plot hole that has to be mentioned related to Thor and the Asgardians, and that is, how are there any Asgardians left on Earth? Presumably that any that survived Ragnarok were on that spaceship. But that spaceship was destroyed at the beginning of Infinity War, so either the Asgardians are all dead, or if they're all strong enough to survive in space like Thor, then they're floating around catatonic in space, waiting to be rescued. Or maybe perhaps there were a few Asgardians visiting other planets throughout the universe, and through happy chance they managed to avoid Ragnarok and the destruction on the spaceship. But regardless, it gives Thor something he still needs to do. He still needs to gather the remaining Asgardians and find them a new home. So even if it's as a static character. Because remember how we said that in Thor: The Dark World, Thor was a static character, in order to give room for Odin and Loki's character reveals and changes. So there's nothing stopping the writers from having Thor become a static character so that other characters can take the spotlight and grow. And after all, isn't there a certain half man, half celestial who could take some workout advice from the mighty Son of Odin? Anyway, those are my thoughts. I appreciate y'all watching to the end. Like and subscribe if you like this video, and stick around because I'm hoping to make part 2 pretty soon. And leave any comments in the comment section below if you like or disagree. I look forward to hearing them.